Hello and welcome back to day 4 of State of the World 2021, a conference brought to you by Florida International University Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs in partnership with the McCain Institute, part of Arizona State University. I'm David Kramer, serving again as your MC for the conference and want to welcome you back, I hope, but if you're joining us for the first time, welcome to you today. We have another full day of sessions, and we are going to kick off this morning with a session that, along with the pandemic and our politics, has also been a dominating issue, and that's about the economic situation that we've all been facing, the global economic crisis. And we have a great group to lead us in this discussion, and to moderate is our own Mihaela Pintea, who is a professor of economics at Florida International University. She's also been a visiting scholar at the International Monetary Fund and held a teaching position at the University of Maryland. And Mihaela, it is over to you to lead today's discussion. Thanks very much for doing it.
David, thank you so much for your introduction. I'm very excited about the conversation that we are going to have with our two panelists, true thought leaders in their field. So we are going to touch on a few economic issues that I feel are relevant to the current global economic climate. We are, of course, in the midst of a major pandemic that brought significant disruptions to economic activity all over the globe, affected patterns of trade, upended the way we work, study, and live, reshaped the role of the government in the economy, and made us reevaluate who and what is essential to maintain a sense of normality. Some of the changes brought by the pandemic have just accelerated trends that were already in place, whereas others might lead to a restructuring of the previous courses of action that we took as given. So I'm thinking about increased global economic integration, for example. So to discuss these issues, I am honored to introduce our panelists, Mark Madish and Moises Nayim. So Mark Madish is a lawyer, banker, and foreign policy expert, president of the Messina Group, a strategic consultancy based in Washington, D.C. He served in senior positions on the National Security Council, the U.S. Treasury, and U.S. aid in the Clinton administration. As a lawyer, he worked on sovereign debt restructuring. He was also vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and president of Guggenheim International. So very exciting for us. He's also a non-resident visiting fellow at FIU's Green School. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you so much.
And then our second panelist is Moises Nayim. So Dr. Nayim is a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's the host and producer of an Emmy-winning television program on international affairs, Effect on Nayim, an internationally syndicated columnist, and an author of many scholarly articles and books on international economics and politics. He has served as Venezuela's Minister of Trade and Industry, Director of Venezuela's Central Bank, and Executive Director of the World Bank. Welcome, Dr. Nayim, and thank you so much to both of you for being here with us.
Thank you.
So I will start with some questions addressed to both of you, and at the same time take questions from the audience, questions that can be asked by using the Q&A feature. So not to shy away from difficult topics, I would like to start with talking about inequality and how the global economic crisis has had an unequal impact on different categories of workers as well as countries. So in particular, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic led to an acceleration of a pre-existing trend? And do you think this increase in inequality brought a new sense of urgency that will lead to the implementation of policies designed to address this issue?
Mark, go ahead.
Okay, well, okay, thank you so much again for having me. It's a real privilege always to visit with FIU. I'm so proud of what the university has achieved, and just kudos to President Rosenberg, Dean Stack, David Kramer. This conference is just a remarkable achievement in difficult times. So thank you for everything you're doing. Professor Pinta, great questions. The pandemic, represents what economists call an exogenous shock to the system. And it's like a big involuntary stress test on all economies, indeed on all political economies. And I think your question really goes to political economics, not just economic output, but also governance, the interaction of the two. The way I see it, an exogenous shock does three main things. It clarifies what's really going on in the system, who's holding risk, who's exposed. It's Warren Buffett's old saying that when the tide goes out, you see who's been swimming naked. And that applies to all sectors of the economy. So it clarifies. It also, a shock like this, of this magnitude, tends to accelerate underlying trends. Because the trends reflect the dominant forces in the economy, and those by definition are the strong ones. There's a Darwinian aspect to this. And it also exacerbates contradictions, gaps in the system, including inequalities, social inequalities that you're pointing to in your question. So I think all those things are happening on a big scale. With respect to the acceleration, I think we see many of the things that were discussed in the Democratic primary debates last year. Someone like Andrew Yang, for example, was highlighting the deep structural changes going on in the economy, from digitalization and automation, and the impact that was having on the labor force. Well, we've seen that it's sort of e-commerce in the digital sector, the tech sector, that has really come out strongest over this past year. That has socioeconomic implications on jobs, on incomes. A few statistics to back up your hypothesis, Professor. I think it's estimated that 20%, more than 20% of women have dropped out of the workforce in the past 10 or 12 months. That's a disparate impact on women. So women, minorities, the poor often get hit hardest during exogenous shocks. And that's what we're seeing here. The question is how quickly we can rebound. And the bigger question is, what do we really do about this? Do we learn any lessons from this shock? Or do we just hope that the cycle will turn? And I think that's really the big question in front of us. Is a paradigm shift possible? And if so, what is the content of that paradigm shift?
Thank you so much. Yes, Dr. Nayim?
Yes, I think it's a very important question. And I think Mark Madish's idea of treating it as an exogenous shock to the system is a very useful one. It's a good way of understanding and putting in perspective the shocks and the aftermath and the sequels of the shock. I think there is a need to unpack the concept of inequality. We tend to speak about inequality as if it was a common phenomenon everywhere. And in fact, I think it's more useful to talk about varieties of inequality, both in terms of the longevity of the problem, how long has that been a main issue in a specific country or region, and also what are the determinants, what are the sources of inequality. And the main points there is inequality has not been the same in terms of how long it has been an issue. In the United States, it went up in the early parts of the 20th century, then it went down, and then it went up significantly, especially after in the early parts of this century, and accelerated after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and so on. The rest of the world have chronic inequality. For some of the countries that have always been affected by inequality, it was kind of interesting to see how Americans and Europeans were discovering inequality. If you talk to a Brazilian, a Ghanaian, an Ugandan, a Chilean, even, or some in Asia, and for them, inequality was part of life. There was nothing new. Inequality is how you were born and how you eventually will be part of the landscape when you die. So there's nothing new with inequality. The thing is that the only new thing about inequality is that it became a very important, significant issue in the United States and in Europe, in parts of Europe. And the United States is excellent at exporting its anxieties. When an issue becomes an issue in the United States and a big debate, that debate is echoed and taken up elsewhere, sometimes with very good consequences. I'm thinking about the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement became global, having started in the US in many ways, and that's good. And the inequality one, we should also welcome that the inequality is now at the center of our conversations. However, the problem is that we treat inequality, as I said before, as a unique problem with a unique set of determinants everywhere. And that is patently not true. The drivers of inequality in Russia are very different than those in Brazil or in India. What's happening to inequality in China, where it is going up, it's different from what's going on in Central Europe and so on. So, and especially the United States. In the United States, the financial dimension, the financialization of inequality is an important factor. It is present elsewhere, but in other places, you could argue that the exchange rate regime, the way in which scarce foreign hard currency is allocated, discretionary by some and given to some that have access to foreign currencies in a preferential basis, and that becomes a devilish inequality creating machinery for countries that have exchange controls and things like that. In other places is the ownership pattern of the land. In others is corruption. So central message is inequality has always been there in many countries. It has become more of an issue because it is now a very important factor in the debate in the United States and Europe. Third, its determinants are very different, and therefore the cures are very different. Finally, the consequences of the pandemic. The pandemic has not created new inequalities. It has revealed inequalities that were there, especially in the health sector. What the pandemic has shown is how a lot of countries don't manage well or their health system. And I'm thinking about the United States. It is very clear that a country that spends 17% of GDP on health is not getting back its investment. We're seeing the pandemic has revealed the frailties, the inequality, the injustice, the asymmetries in the distribution of vaccines, for example. And so what is very important is to understand that we're talking about a central feature of what drives poverty in many countries, which is very, very bad health systems. Remember that the poor have two fundamental assets, the brains and minds and the bodies, the health. So they need to be healthy and they need to be educated. And those two, education and health, are two areas that are defective and therefore drive inequality in a lot of countries.
So, Doc, thank you. Thank you for pointing out the international aspect of it. It's true. We always think from the US perspective. And I mean, not only us, but yeah, economies, international organizations such as the IMF started to be concerned about inequality for the past 10 years, precisely because inequality became a problem in the US, whereas, as you pointed out, in a lot of other countries, this inequality issue has been around forever. But yes, I mean, US does have still has the dominance in terms of ideas, and the concerns that are the US concerns became the concerns of the world. And this is what economists are focusing on and trying to address and trying to resolve. But yeah, it's always a good idea to remind ourselves that there are a lot of other countries in the world that have faced like different issues, and we should pay attention to that even when US doesn't face the same issues. But however, the pandemic, yes, did bring up an increase in inequality in developing countries as well. So the shutdowns in the economy did affect mostly the people that don't have access to remote work, which are the people that were working in low-paying industries, the people that could least afford to lose their income. So we do have an increase in the number of poor people all over the world. So speaking of other countries and developing countries, they had clearly additional challenges. So based on some projected vaccine rollouts, the return on normalcy can be significantly lagged from that of the OECD countries with vaccine supply deals. They also had less of an ability to implement major fiscal stimulus programs. So what is your view of their economic future?
Should I start? It's a great question, and I would underscore something that Moises pointed out, which is that the picture is not monolithic. There's a wide array of patterns of inequality. There's a wide array of impacts of the COVID pandemic. Biology is nonlinear. Epidemiology is actually nonlinear as it spreads around the globe. So we see a lot of differences among countries. And it also links to the question of political economy. It would be great if there were some simple lessons here that the democracies did better than the authoritarian countries. The wealthy countries did better than the middle income, or some kinds of the correlations are extremely weak. We have a data set that is very diverse. And still needs explanation. It'll be the subject, I think, of PhD dissertations. It's a rich field. If they're FIU students who are looking for a dissertation topic, comparative COVID response could be a very interesting one to illuminate political economy. Because as Moises said, we've seen incompetent democracies. I mean, the assumption would have been that the wealthy OECD countries would have been on top of this. And in fact, it's the US and the EU in different respects that have looked incompetent to their own citizens. The horrible authoritarian countries, China, which was blamed for the origin of the virus and all that, actually has now bounced back economically sooner and more strongly than any other major economy. But democracies in Asia have also done well: Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand. So again, this mixed picture, I think, is interesting in and of itself. On inequality, if I may say, and Moises suggested this, why is it an issue in the US today? Well, it's because the trend line has been so worrying, right? The US Gini coefficient, which is a ratio of the wealthiest fifth to the lowest fifth, the US ranks worst among the G7, and the gap is widening. That's why it's an issue. And so what do you do about it? I think it's interesting that another word is emerging in the discussion, not only inequality, but equity. Mm-hmm. Equity. We've seen that in the recent political discussions, the way that Biden has rolled out his plans. I think that's important because he's asking a question about fairness of the process. So there's inequality and there's fairness. One needs to look at both aspects. And that goes to governance.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I can elaborate on this, but I don't want to talk too long.
Well, I think those are very important points. The political economy of hunger, of poverty, of inequality, and what that is doing to political systems, and the people left behind by the prosperity of their countries, as we can see in some, especially in the United States, a significant segment of the population that does not feel represented, or that feels that the prosperity that is concentrating in some places is not reaching them. And so that's there, and that has to do a lot with the polarization, the divisions that we see in the United States and elsewhere. And I thought it was very interesting, Mark's points about new words that have become more common. And equity is one, fairness is another. Pardon. But all of that is true. And it's a welcome addition. I think it's very important that these words become more frequently used, discussed, debates everywhere. But there is another word that I think we should put at the center of the conversation, and that is poverty. And very often poverty is correlated with inequality, but in some places you just have poverty. Dire, terrible, horrible poverty, where people are dying of hunger, where children are not eating. And that is one of the consequences of the pandemic. The pandemic destroyed jobs. And these are especially informal, and you, Professor, had the point about how those that are losing jobs are especially those in the lower segments of income, in the income distribution structure, And again, some of the measures you need to deal with that are different. To deal with dire poverty, with extreme poverty, are not the same as the tools you use to deal with inequality. In fighting inequality, the tax systems and fiscal concerns and the way budgets are allocated and how the funds are raised and deployed is very important in the fight against inequality. It is instead the way you deal with poverty is different. There you can talk about the universal income for all citizens and the conditional cash transfers and all of that. I want also to highlight a point you made, Professor, at the beginning that has to do with who bears the burden of the adjustment when there are the shocks that Mark Madish points out, the external shocks that are so common in developing countries. When that happens, historically, the burden was borne by the lower rung. The poorest people pay the consequences of the economic adjustments very often. Mm-hmm. Now, the situation in many countries is a bit different and more complicated and more politically explosive. Because what happened in the early part of this century is that in a lot of these countries, a new middle class appeared. People that were poor and thanks to the booming commodities and other favorable conditions, especially conditional cash transfers in a lot of countries. So a combination of government policies and international economic conditions allowed the poverty to go down in a lot of countries. In Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, especially in commodity exporting countries. So there was this middle class in Latin America during this first decades of the 20th century. So the most numerous middle class in history. So there was the recently poor people that became lower middle class that had resources to buy cars or have a better house and so on. And now this external shock and the problems with unemployment and lack of jobs is hitting them too. So now the burden of adjustment is not just on the poor, is on the poor, but also on the incipient new middle class, which is more educated, more connected, and desperately trying not to slide back into poverty. And that makes for the streets in flames that we see around the world. People are taking to the streets in their fight not to slide back into poverty, in their fight to retain privileges and access to possibilities that they didn't have before. And that is going to be an important shaper of politics in a lot of countries.
Yes, so I mean, a lot of economic research says that in order for people to escape poverty and move into middle class, you have to have like at least 15 years of good things happening to you or nothing bad happening to you. And clearly the pandemic, it's something bad that's happening and affecting millions and millions of people across the world. So the ability to acquire human capital, which we consider to be a precondition for economic development, has been affected. So schools across the world were closed and millions of children shifted to some kind of remote learning, which in some countries or for certain socioeconomic categories means no learning. So remote learning means no learning. So the duration of the school closing, the access to remote learning vary significantly depending on the country. And then even in the US, going back to the US, since we are still US centric, children from lower income families fell behind more due to the disruption brought by the COVID-19. And children from minority households fell behind more due to these disruptions. So what do you think the long-term effects of these disruptions are going to be? So it's not just something that we thought we were going to bounce back within 3 months, like the virus is going to be away, but now we are talking about 1-2 years of lost schooling. In a lot of countries, it meant that kids are just going to drop out of school. That might have effect on child marriages, actually an increase in poverty, and women, girls don't having access to school means they're going to get married, which means another generation that might be affected in the long term. So once we bounce back from the virus, these people that just started their life are going to be affected for the rest of their life, including people that start. It has been shown that people that start their employment during a recession, they're going to have lower income, lower salary for the rest of their life. So what do you think about these long-term effects?
Good question. If I may, I'd like to first develop a point that was implicit in what Moises Nayim laid out so helpfully. And I love his historical perspective in trying to understand the situation we're in today, because I think the big question hanging over us is, what will globalization 3.0 look like? Mm-hmm. In the past 20 years, one way to look at things is that we have suffered 3 huge shocks to the globalization thesis. And the globalization period since, let's say, the 80s, the rise of emerging markets, and after the collapse of communism, more integration, more convergence around policies, huge increases in output, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty around the world, hundreds of millions. This is non-trivial, but we've suffered 3 big question marks. 9/11 was one, right? That the US was hit and suddenly asked fundamental questions about not investing so much in security. Mm-hmm. So suddenly we lost the peace dividend, as it was called, of the post-Cold War era, and countries needed to invest in security again. We got scared of the world again. The naivete wore off. Then we had the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, profound. And it started in the US. The contagion started in the US. So the country that had lectured everybody else on how to organize their economic governance was the locus of the earthquake that shook the global financial system. It didn't come from Russia or from China, East Asia, as it had in the 90s. It came from the US. And now we have the pandemic. By the way, not the first pandemic. Even in its name, this is SARS-2, and we can fully expect there will be a SARS-3, and that we should probably be calling this COVID-21, not COVID-19, even at this point, given the mutations. Yes. So I just want to put that larger frame forward that I think is a challenge to policymakers in the G7, in the OECD, in the dialogues with the emerging markets of the world is what will be the new rules of the road for globalization. The biggest single question out there is the relationship between US and China, because right now we're headed in the direction of a dichotomous system of two ecosystems, two technological ecosystems, because of the competition and mistrust between these two largest economies. That could have deep implications for the future of globalization. So sorry, I wanted to just put that frame question out there. Your question on education is outstanding, and Moises should come back on this. But on education, you've put your finger on it. I believe we need to re-examine the structure of education in all countries. We look at some of the most exciting work in the field of educational economics by Jim Heckman and Angus Deaton, for example, that shows that investment in the earliest years of education have the biggest socioeconomic payoffs. And we're not talking about even grade school. We're talking about infancy, 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old. This is where, and we need to begin investing in education younger and longer in life, because people are living longer and technological change is having an impact on what skills are relevant. We need to begin to think of re-education as a lifelong process if our citizens are to remain productive. So that's my little sermon on education. So yes, we need of course safety nets and redistributive assistance, but to make our economies and societies dynamic and resilient, we're going to have to invest in education on entirely new levels, in my view.
Yeah, probably reevaluate the way we educate, like you said, not just one set and then you're done for life, but every 10 years.
Yeah, I need to go back to school. I'm ready. I'm envious of my kids.
Me too. So let me answer to your point, Professor, about the long-term consequences, and then a comment on education. I share completely the lament about the quality of education and the performance of the educational system. But before, let me answer to your question about the long-term consequences. The first part of the answer is that we don't know yet. It's too soon, it's still happening, and we are being surprised every day with new developments that no one anticipated. And we are in the midst of it. And Mark Madish is right in saying that we should call this COVID-21, and let's hope it doesn't become COVID-22 or COVID forever, which is a possibility, a scenario in which the humanity is constantly attacked by a variety of viruses for which it doesn't have ready immediate vaccines and therapeutics. So the first part of the answer is too soon. The IMF just released last week its World Economic Outlook, in which announces that the world's economy shrank 3.5% in 2020, that they anticipate is going to grow 5.5% this year, and next year 4.2%. And then it breaks it down in different countries and different regions. And again, we see the diversity of consequences. Some consequences are doing better than others. Some countries are doing better than others, but everybody is, there is this rebound that is beginning. But if we have learned, and this is my second point about long-term consequences, is that if we have learned something, or we should learn something, are two things. First is the reactions of the governments and the United States government. Mark Madish made a reference to 9/11 and its consequences and the long legs that had. And then the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 also has consequences that are still with us today. In both cases, you could argue that the reactions of the government were more defining than the triggering fact. The reactions to the attacks on 9/11, the United States reaction, with wars in different countries and until now, the forever wars, more people were touched and lives changed and countries reshaped by the reaction to 9/11 than the events of 9/11. I'm not here minimizing the tragedy of 9/11 and treating it with utmost respect. But in terms of life touched, life changed, life ended as a result of government reaction to 9/11, that is an important example of how government reactions shape the consequences, the long-term consequences of these global earthquakes. The same, exactly the same with different, of course, is a financial crisis of 2008, 2009. That happened in the world of finance, but you can still argue that the reactions to that crash, to that crisis, was more important in shaping financial systems and the workings of the international economy than the triggering effect itself. So that's one point about long-term consequences. The other learnings that I think we can take from the consequences is that institutions, ideas, things, ways of thinking, business models that we thought were permanent have proven to be transitory. And effects that we thought were transitory have become permanent. Think, for example, about remote work. At the beginning, we all said, well, you know, this is for now, you know, until we have the social distancing and keep people at home and people can work from home. And then when the economy recovers and we go back to normal, everybody goes back to the office. Well, not a lot of people are not going back to offices, and companies are changing their organizational structures, even the way they work, their protocols, their routines, their reporting methods, and their technologies. So a part of the remote work that we thought was going to be transitional has become now permanent and in significant ways. Mm-hmm. And then things that we thought permanent, unmovable, untouchable, that we could take for granted have proven to be under stress. I'm talking about democracy in the United States, for example. You know, witnessing and watching on television the attack on the US Capitol, you say, well, what banana republic I'm watching, what the politics, what is this? Well, we saw things that we never expected to see in the United States. So this is my point about how the pandemic has made some things that were temporary permanent, and some things that are permanent now are in doubt about we are in doubt about their permanence. And democracy, I think, is under stress around the world as a result of the economic consequences of the pandemic. Finally, with education, I completely share both of you, your views. I think that education was underperforming before the pandemic and is now underperforming even worse. Before the pandemic, all the studies about performance show that students are not performing adequately. That educational systems that are good are the minority and the exception to the rule, but the normal process of educating a young person is not working in most of the world. And massive budgets are being allocated to education, but the returns to those budgets, to that investments, leave much to be desired. And we don't have, we have a consensus that a dramatic reform, an important change on how people are educated is sorely, urgently needed. But after having consensus about that, there is no consensus about what it actually means and how it is done.
Okay, thanks. So going back to Mark's point about the US-China different poles of power, there's a question in the chat regarding what specific role do international organizations play in the recovery of developing economies? And how will international financial institutions led by China compete with Western-dominated institutions in this effort? If you'd like to address that.
Well, great question. The international financial institutions have a big role to play. We're talking about the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks, and also the new ones that China has sponsored, for example, the infrastructure bank that's tied to the Belt and Road Initiative. We need the entire arsenal to be working together to address the exogenous crisis, the shock of the pandemic. And again, the needs are going to be different in different countries, and really that's what most of these institutions are very good at, is analyzing country by country needs and trying to devise support plans involving both financial support and technical advice on reforms. The institutions are not perfect. There can never be a substitute for domestic policy making. These are tools at the margin. They are tools that can help avoid the worst outcomes. For example, in the humanitarian area that Moises mentioned about extreme poverty, I mean, that requires just direct intervention and support. And we're going to have more of those crises. We see them unfolding, not only related to the pandemic, but again to regional wars and civil wars. All of that is still happening in the world. So back to the question asked about the rivalry between the US and China on this, and that's an issue. I mean, I think that actually the Obama administration, in my view, made an error in not cooperating with, participating in the new Chinese-led institutions. Mm-hmm. And that was particularly because some of our allies wanted to resist those institutions for their own reasons. But the notion that only the US can be an architect of multilateral institutions, I think is a questionable assumption in this day and age. And given the shape of economic power in the world, it shouldn't be surprising that a country as large and powerful and influential as China would want to shape multilateral institutions. So I think that dialogue needs to somehow improve. It can improve. But at the moment, let's face it, we are in the midst of a two-fronted Cold War, the United States is, with Russia and with China. They're very different countries. The reasons are distinct. But the question is, can we somehow de-escalate the tensions? I think particularly with China will be very, very important to answer this question. With Russia, the big secret is the US actually doesn't need a very robust relationship. We need to avoid accidental nuclear war. That's the most important thing. And then hopefully reach some understandings about regional conduct. With China, the relationship is so much more complex on many different levels, economic, financial, and trade, and so forth. We actually need a healthy relationship with China, a fair amount of constructive cooperation. If we don't have it, I predict we will have much worse outcomes in the world for both countries and for other third regions.
Thank you. Dr. Nayim, would you like to address?
Yeah. The China-US relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, as Mark mentions. And I think there's a consensus converging that those two countries will in coming years will be competing fiercely and at times with great aggressiveness, and at times and they will also be collaborating and coordinating. So it's both. We're going to be living in a world in which the United States and China continue the competition over technology, the control of some sea lanes, politics, control of multilateral institutions, technology, regulation, the internet. All of these things are going to be part of the arenas of competition between these two supergiant superpowers. What is important is a phrase that Mark Madish mentioned, which is everyone has to ensure that these rivalries do not escalate and become more fierce out of control kind of clashes, including armed conflicts. The world, these two countries and the world have their future on avoiding the escalation of a clash between the United States and China. So there will be competition, there will be dirty tricks, as we already see, there will be rivalries, but there also there will be agreement and cooperation. And again, I hope all kinds of arrangements, institutional and otherwise, that prevent the conflicts to escalate beyond control. So that's one. The question was about the role of multilaterals. What the pandemic revealed is that, you know, the origin of the pandemic was very global. It's quite amazing how the virus jumped around the world at great speed, following the most unexpected itineraries, from Wuhan to Milano, and from Milan to Latin America and the United States. So it was an example of globalization. If you want, if you think globalization is dead, well, just take a look at what happened with the virus and its itinerary around the world. So it was a very global crisis that was then, the response was very local. Each country decided to do it on their own, and even each local government, you know, remember at the time of respirators, everybody was looking where to buy. You know, we saw governors from around the world and majors looking to buy respirators for their own country or region or city. Now we see the same as with the vaccine. You know, we have vaccine protectionism and hoarding and manipulating markets and things like that. So a crisis that will require a global response, a coordinated, synchronized, multilateral global response is being answered very locally, very nationally still, with some elements of collaboration and coordination. But the pandemic just revealed how frail, inefficient, and inadequate is the multilateral system in dealing with this kind of emergencies, and how strengthening multilateralism to deal with these global events that cannot be tackled by any country acting alone in an effective way, where synchronization and coordination is necessary. That is an insight that has to be at front and center of the activities of governments trying to coordinate with others, and to those that are resorting to vaccine nationalism and protectionism in a very damaging way.
Well, I think both China and Russia are using, you know, the production of vaccine to acquire, you know, power or strategic importance in different countries across the world that don't have access to the you know, the most typical vaccine, let's put it this way. So there's another question from the audience about globalization, and not necessarily related to the coronavirus pandemic. So what is the relationship between globalization and the race for access to scarce resources?
Moises, do you want to go first? I always go first. I feel.
No, that's okay. Go ahead. You go ahead. You talk, and I agree with you on that.
Well, that's a big question. You know, we just talked about China. So China is often thought of as a great example of a rising power that is seeking access to badly needed resources and commodities to fuel its continued growth. And so many of its policies sort of follow logically from that, building up its trade and economic relations across Eurasia, into Africa, into Latin America. The whole Belt and Road is, I think, a great example of one country's strategic mission to try to secure access to much needed resources, whether it's oil and gas, you know, fossil fuels, oil and gas, or rare earth metals in the Congo and so forth. And these are big endeavors that involve huge infrastructure projects from ports to railways, and to all kinds of negotiations around trade agreements. So yes, I mean, I think that that's part of the nature of competition under globalization. In an earlier era, it was called imperialism. Today, that's channeled in different ways, but yes, there is a competition for resources. Water is another important resource, by the way. So that's a very general answer to an excellent question that could be another great PhD dissertation at FIU.
So competition for resources and control of routes and trade lines and supply chains has always been there. It was accelerated during the 90s and this century with digitalization and globalization, in which the integration of countries became much more, became deeper and more consequential. So there's nothing new under the sun. Countries need resources and raw materials and basic inputs, and there's a competition for that. What is new is the nature. What is it that that is more coveted? Oil and gas are, declining, and everybody assumes that in the next 30, 40 years, oil and gas will have less of a weight in national economies, and that decarbonization of the economies, the sharp reduction in the consumption of hydrocarbons will be very important, and the coal and oil will be less in demand. That is already reflected in stock prices. Today, Netflix, the television, the streaming company, is worth more than ExxonMobil, which is a giant in the world of natural resources, oil and gas especially. If you want to have an important role in the future, what would you rather have? A strong control of wind and solar technologies, and self-driving electric cars? Or would you like to have a patch of land where you go and look for oil and gas? So what I'm saying is that the nature of the resources that over which countries are competing has changed. And it's different to compete for dominance or presence in the world of high technology that it was in the world of soybeans or cotton or timber or oil and gas.
Well, I mean, yes, but there are some rare minerals that are needed for computers or for.
That is a manifestation of the new structure of the economies, right?
Absolutely. But actually going back a little bit to 9/11 and the trend that followed the global crisis from 2008, I would say that we saw a reduction in the importance of the global trade that was accelerated by the coronavirus pandemic, that the COVID-19 pandemic brought disruption in the global supply chains. And then as a consequence of that, firms and governments started to place higher priority on the resilience of supply. So to bring the supply chains closer to home. So do you think you will see more of protectionist policies and emphasis on interregional trade as opposed to global one going forward?
Well, it's certainly one of the big conundrums for the shape of globalization 3.0, as I called it before. The way to resolve it is, I think it's perfectly legitimate for countries to seek domestic resilience, because after all, why all the criticism at the country level for performance in response to the coronavirus? It's what is the capacity of the country, of the state, to respond to the needs of citizens. So, I think there's a smart version of protectionism. It has to be very narrowly defined, but the notion that countries ought to be able to have domestic delivery systems that are dependent on far-flung supply chains need not be the end of globalization. It's a question of a balance point. And I think at the moment, you know, certainly in the trade war with China, we've been headed in the opposite direction. It ties into the last also about resources, because there's a resource we didn't name in this context, and that's human capital. Human capital, that ties to education. So one of the other conundrums of the present moment is that the US, one of our leading sectors has always been higher education. People from around the world came here to build knowledge base. But now, partly because of our rivalry with China, we've lost our confidence in that model. Chinese students are viewed with suspicion. Are they agents of foreign influence? Are they stealing technology? Can we even let them in anymore? I'm dramatizing only a bit. That is going to pose a big challenge to our model. If the US closes its doors in that way, that type of protectionism could really shatter globalization as we've known it.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I can only add, I think that was a perfect description of the situation. I can only add that whenever there are these major tectonic accidents in the global economy, the predictions about trade have always been wrong. After 9/11, after the financial crisis, the idea was that there was going to be a major global surge in protectionism, isolationism, obstacles to trade. And yes, we saw a little bit of that. We saw flares of that. But if you look at the numbers, global trade has continued to be strong and robust, and seemingly immune to the to the workings and the volatility of international politics and economics.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, so I would like, given all the disruption in trade, economy that we talked about, in the spirit of not letting a good crisis go to waste, what major policy changes brought by the COVID-19 would you like to see permanent? So any final thoughts on that?
Great question. And this goes back to something you asked early on, Professor, but I don't think we answered, which is whether there was a heightened sense of urgency among policymakers. And I think we should talk about that briefly. I was chatting with a very senior new appointee in the Biden administration, financial policymaker, and he or she said to me, quote, "We feel we have one last chance to get it right." And what she was referring to was really this globalization 3.0, but also democratic market capitalism. And this really is a question of addressing what you started with, inequality, what we discussed, equity and fairness, and how also to return to smart multilateralism to deal with collective action problems at the global level, whether it's climate change or health, as well as education. So I'm encouraged. I think there is a sense of urgency right now. What we must hope is that this doesn't dissipate. And you can already see the Biden administration is wrangling with this. How much emphasis to put on short-term stimulus versus longer-term structural reforms in its initial work with Congress, on the assumption that the honeymoon, such as it is, won't last very long. We need to get to those deeper structural reforms. And so we mustn't let this serious crisis go to waste, to quote Rahm Emanuel.
Thank you.
I'm glad that we have this opportunity, this last question, to address something that it's urgent and we haven't touched has not shown up in this conversation and is indispensable, and that is climate change. We have not talked about climate change It should be at the top of everybody's priority. It's good news that President Biden has made the United States rejoin the Paris Accords. It's good news that John Kerry is the czar for international efforts towards containing containing emissions, so there are movements there. But if there is one priority that is more important and is above in priority, in urgency, in emergency than anything else that one can talk about, is climate change. And so the moving in the right direction now, but it probably needs to be accelerated and made more global.
Thank you. I guess that was the end.
Great. Mihaela, thank you so much. Mark, Moises, the three of you really provided us with a wonderful tutorial. This is going to be, I think, a very valuable recording for courses here at the university and elsewhere as well. Incredibly grateful to the three of you, in particular, Mark and Moises, being friends of FIU for sure, but being up in DC, joining us today. And Mihaela, thank you so much for leading the discussion. Really appreciate it. Great conversation. We are going to take a 14-minute break, to be precise, and we'll be back at 10:15 with our next panel, Changes Afoot in Eurasia, with a question mark. So stay tuned for that. And again, thanks so much for joining us for this session.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
As a student who is interested in looking to go into politics in the future, having the experience of State of the World is one of the best things that we can get.
So at this event, we will see panelists throughout the 2 days from all walks of life. There are journalists, there are scholars, there are actual diplomats themselves, and they discuss prevalent issues to today's international communities.
Human trafficking is now part of the conversation.
Our original response on the 29th of December to their rocket attacks on us on the 27th of December was absolutely justifiable and right under international law.
I don't think that if you talk to any Democrat, they would tell you that impeachment was good politics for them.
This is an experience that students don't get on a daily basis, because despite the fact that you can learn a lot in classes and in lectures, you can't experience having a real-life policymaker, a real-life scientist there in front of you, explaining to you the intricacies of these foreign situations and conflicts.
You've assembled such an amazing group of people here that it's become this sort of meeting place early in the new year. So it's to really become the first conference of the new year.
State of the World proves that every concept we learn in poli-sci courses, in international relations courses, in any one of those social sciences, how they are applicable to real-day issues and events that we are seeing.
Hopefully when you leave here today, you'll be enabled to have an even louder voice than you already have.
I think you've really established something here at FIU that you should be very proud of.